In a day all about the power of the image, this one as potent as any. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Jong Un together for the first time, all part of a grand show of power designed to cast doubt on a Western-led world order and to reinforce among China's people, especially its young, a sense of loyalty to a state that President Xi says defeated its oppressors 80 years ago and whose new rise is unstoppable.
The Chinese people stood united, rose up in resistance and fought for the survival of the country, the rejuvenation of the nation and the cause of human justice. Today, humanity once again faces a choice between peace and war, dialogue and confrontation, mutual benefit and zero-sum competition. The Chinese people firmly stand on the right side of history.
This was, in China's terminology, the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War, otherwise known as World War II. A chance to assert China's role in the defeat of Japan, one that Beijing has long felt deliberately minimized in the West. Even if the fact that the Chinese nationalists, rather than the communists, led that fight was itself something to gloss over. But then Tiananmen Square is hardly a stranger to the Communist Party's historical revisionism. A day too for present day as well as historical narrative, China positioning itself as all too ready to fill global leadership roles that the United States under President Trump has vacated. Indeed, after Trump's reported disappointment with his own military parade back in June, a penny for his thoughts watching this. In fact, they came free of charge, Trump asking on his Truth Social network whether President Xi would mention the massive amount of support and blood the United States of America gave to China in order to help it secure its freedom, and asking him to please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Jong Un as you conspire against the United States of America. The Kremlin responded that no one was plotting anything, indeed only too happy to promote publicly Russia's growing cooperation with North Korea, whose supreme leader seemed to acknowledge that some may be more supreme than others, thanking President Putin for finding the time to meet. South Korean intelligence says some 2,000 North Korean troops have now been killed fighting for Russia against Ukraine, Kim implying more might yet do so.
As I mentioned to you during our previous meeting, if there is any way we can assist Russia, we will certainly do it as a fraternal duty. We will spare no effort in providing help to Russia.
Your soldiers fought courageously and heroically. I would like to note that we will never forget the sacrifices that your armed forces and the families of your servicemen have suffered.
No sign of Chinese concerns about US secondary tariffs for dealing in Russian energy, confirmation of a second gas pipeline to be built from Siberia to China, and an increase in supply through the current one. But events in Beijing more about potential future war fighting than the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. China's People's Liberation Army displaying a number of nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missiles, including the Dongfeng 5C, which it said could strike anywhere in the world, and the previously secret DF-61, rolling past on its mobile launch system. But alongside its nuclear deterrent, one designed to deter something much more specific, US intervention in any future conflict over Taiwan. These, China says, are its latest hypersonic ship killers, their purpose to take out any US vessels coming to Taiwan's aid, something that can be left unsaid. Evidence too that, like all militaries, China has been studying the drone war in Ukraine, as well as unmanned vehicles on display, an anti-drone microwave weapon. Although in each case, as with the suspiciously immobile robot wolves, display doesn't necessarily mean capacity. As for the political display, the roll call of absentees certainly longer and with greater economic and military muscle than those who were here. But as 80,000 balloons and 80,000 doves were released amid President Xi's calls for peaceful coexistence, this was an expression in technicolor of his multi-layered ambition to maintain domestic control, to regain Taiwan, and to reshape the international system. Well, joining us now is Dr. Walter C. Ladwig III. He's an associate fellow at RUSI, a think tank here in the UK, and he specializes in South Asian security and irregular warfare. Dr. Ladwig, thank you very much for joining us. In terms of the military hardware to start with, what was your main takeaway? There were these pretty large and some previously unveiled intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see what sort of messages the Chinese government and the Chinese military are trying to send to the world about where they are today. I mean, the big picture takeaway is trying to position the People's Liberation Army as a very modern fighting force that's comparable to those in the West. And then beneath that, there's some very specific pointed messages. So you noted the ICBMs. This is, I believe, the first time we've seen evidence of sea, air, and ground-launched missiles in the Chinese arsenal, so a complete nuclear triad, underscoring the strength of their deterrence, sending a veiled message to potential adversaries about China's guaranteed ability to strike back. The hypersonic and anti-ship missiles are certainly targeted politically, if not actually at the United States and the U.S. Navy, again, trying to send a clear signal about China's ability and determination to try to push the U.S. Navy out of the Indo-Pacific, which would have clear implications for Taiwan. I think some of the things around directed energy and drones also make it really clear that the Chinese have been studying contemporary wars, what's been going on in Ukraine and elsewhere, and are learning the same kind of battlefield lessons that they're learning in London and Washington and other parts of the world.
And to what extent do we know whether all of these are fully operational, fully tested, and equipped throughout the People's Liberation Army?
I think that the answer is going to depend based on the types of technologies, you know, the directed energy weapons and things like that we're seeing for the first time are probably in a prototype phase. We've been seeing hypersonics for some time, but I think it's really important for your audience to keep in mind that simply having a technology or having a weapon system doesn't mean that it's going to work or that you've got the armed forces that can make it work. And I think part of what is being projected here by focusing on the hardware is to distract attention away from the software of the Chinese military. So distract attention away from the corruption scandals and the purges of senior military officers that Xi has undertaken, and the real questions about wartime operational readiness in this force.
Nonetheless, if China is saying at least that it has these pretty wide-ranging capacities, especially when it comes to hypersonic ship-killing missiles, things that can attack US bases in Guam, for instance, as well, to what extent does that hamper US options in a hypothetical future war over Taiwan?
Yeah, this is something that U.S. naval planners and U.S. strategists have been contending with for some time. It was years ago that China first unveiled its carrier killer ballistic missiles, and now they're talking about, as you said, the Guam killer. And so this is going to put the U.S. into sort of a cat and mouse game of trying to disperse forces, harden bases, make things less detectable, more maneuverable. And so it's an iterative exercise. It's not simply that one side develops a technology that automatically trumps the other. The other side then has to go back and react and adapt.
You're talking about the software within the Chinese military. What about the political software on show here as well? There seems to be a very deliberate attempt to showcase the friendship, the unity between the leaders of North Korea, Russia, and China.
Absolutely. And I think we need to see this parade for what it is, which is political theater. There's very clearly an attempt to send a message that China constitutes an alternative pole or could perhaps be the center point for an alternative bloc in world politics. But if you take those two you've already mentioned and throw in the other people we are aware who've attended, leaders from Burma, Iran, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, collectively speaking, this is not a force that's a counterweight to NATO, to the G7, to the West. It's largely a collection of countries that are rather economically weak, heavily dependent on China, either politically, economically, or both. Many are pariah states that are sanctioned. Leaders, Putin himself, right, has an ICC judgments against him and is wanted as a war criminal. This is not a very strong bloc in world politics. It's more of a parade of pariahs, if we're honest about it, which rather than showing how strong China is, if these are the best they can gather together for such an important display, I think it raises a lot of questions about fundamental weakness.
Well, but presumably, though, China would like to see this as a bit of a hinge point at a time when the United States is very publicly withdrawing from its NATO role, at least in Europe, when it is also very publicly withdrawing from some of the soft power that it has for so long enjoyed in terms of US aid around the world. Is there not something believable in the Chinese position that China is ready to step in to these spaces being vacated by the current US administration?
The Trump administration is absolutely opening the door for China to try to take advantage of it for all the reasons that you've underlined. The question is whether China is really capable and whether the core of countries that want to work with China are really capable of sort of reshaping and taking the world in another direction. It's worth probing and looking in detail at what your friends bring to the table. You have a Russia which is bogged down by a war in Ukraine, which requires North Korean troops to help sustain its combat operations, which is reliant on Iranian drones. Is this a Russia that's a partner that adds more than it subtracts from you or not? I think it's an open question. So there's no doubt that China is willing to defy the United States or the Trump administration, in part, I think, because on the questions of trade, on the questions of rare earths, it feels it has the upper hand. But again, I don't look at the coalition that China is building and see them as ones who are going to tip the balance in world power.
All right, Dr. Ludwig, thank you very much for your time and your analysis today.
Thank you.